Today I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the American attitude about the United Nations. And this is a very appropriate time to do that because the United Nations General Assembly is meeting in New York City this week, beginning today, and over 100 high-level national leaders will be meeting for a special General Assembly opening as they do every year. But this year it has even more importance because there'll be a high-level global summit of these leaders. And this summit is especially held in relationship to the Global Climate Summit that will be held in Copenhagen in December. It is hoped that world leaders will begin a discussion. And for this reason, I think there may be more attention spent on the United Nations this year than usual. Watching the news and paying attention, trying to focus in on the United Nations is something that Americans don't do very much. We tend to think of the United Nations once in a while. Our American media doesn't cover much on the United Nations, even though it's housed in Manhattan. And most Americans, as with so many other things, pay attention only when they need to. And so this week is a great week to say, yes, Americans will pay attention to the United Nations, but it's only because those leaders are in New York for the week, and there are protests going on, and there are support groups going on, and there's a lot of material being generated that the media can take a handle on and then put on our local broadcasts. So most Americans, if they do know much about the United Nations, if they do focus much about the United Nations, tend to look at it perhaps from, well, two perspectives. One, the first perspective is the wonderful things the United Nations can do around the world and how the United Nations can bring people together and help others. And the month of October in the United States is a month where we pay attention a little bit to part of the United Nations, and that is UNICEF, the Children's Fund, because Halloween, which is actually the #2 holiday in the United States these days, mainly because adults like to dress up and go partying, the Halloween is traditionally a trick-or-treat holiday where children go door to door and ask people for treats, and those treats being candy and cookies and so forth. About 30 years ago, someone from UNICEF had a wonderful idea that to keep children from eating so many sweets, why don't children collect money for needy children around the world? And the UNICEF Fund Halloween Drive was begun. For many Americans, October is a month where we think of UNICEF, and we see advertisements for UNICEF, and we have some of the children who go trick-or-treating with their UNICEF boxes. And for many Americans, that is the United Nations. For more informed Americans, the United Nations is an organization that is both loved and respected, and at the same time questioned. There are several questions that come up, several concerns. The United States is one of the members of the Security Council, and that is very important to Americans. Americans want to be sure that the United States keeps its veto power in the Security Council. Informed Americans also look at the Security Council as a major tool in getting things done. And they're concerned about expanding the size of the Security Council that would take even, with more countries involved or members of the Security Council, it would lead to even more time spent trying to discuss issues and trying to get anything done. So Americans want to keep their position in the Security Council, and they don't want the size of the council to change. They don't want their position changed at that. So that is a concern. Another concern is that some Americans feel concerned that the UN might infringe in some way on U.S. sovereignty concerning different issues. So that becomes problematic. During nationalized debates on the American role in the UN, you have some, as I say, who are very, very for UN participant. The vast majority of Americans in the know are very much pro-United States involvement and participation fully in the United Nations. But there's a fringe element that very much is against. And we have that fringe element when we talk about whether it's the United Nations or NATO or any other organization that the United States is actively involved in. And the United States is involved in many, many organizations. As we look to the United Nations, one of the things we see as incredibly important is where is the United States going in the future. And those fringe elements would like to see the United Nations pushed out and America taking a stronger and stronger role. But most Americans who do know anything feel that the United Nations is a strong vehicle to try to work as a unit, the world together. And the importance of the United Nations is highlighted in those people and in the discussions, and the continuing support. It may sound like a small amount, but it adds up to quite a lot. Each year the United States pays about $598 million in dues to the United Nations. For each American, that's less than $2. And less than $2 doesn't sound like much, but 598 million does. And many Americans feel strongly that they want to stay involved in the UN, they want to participate, they want to continue, and many other payments are made to the United Nations from private as well as governmental organizations to support United Nations efforts over and above their annual dues. But most Americans would like to see other countries paying more if they can. And the EU has recently increased its annual budget for the UN, which has pleased Americans very much, and are encouraging countries like China and other large countries that are growing and have more budget to spend to devote more of that budget to the United Nations. And I think that one of the things that many of us would like to see is more acknowledgement of the United Nations in the American press on a regular basis, and more emphasis on what is being done through the United Nations. One of the most well-known foundations in the United States, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, began its donations through the United Nations, and it actually began its work through the United Nations and still works through the United Nations today. And very few Americans pay attention to that, but they do pay attention to the work of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And if the media would help bring those together and show some of the united fronts that we do have on issues, I think that would be very useful.